Imagine waking up one day thinking it's just another normal day. You step into your routine, but by the end of the day, everything changes. The person you once loved, the person you thought you knew, vanishes. For those left behind, it's not just the loss of a loved one, it's a mystery that could tear apart everything they thought they understood. This is the haunting story of Dee Ann Warner, a woman who vanished without a trace, leaving behind unanswered questions and a chilling final message. What happened to her? Was she a victim of circumstance, or was this disappearance something darker? The night of April 24th, 2021 was supposed to be like any other night. It was late, the kind of quiet that envelops small towns after the day's activities have come to an end. But for Dee Ann Warner, that night was anything but ordinary. In the small farming community of Lenawee County, Michigan, a disappearance would occur that would ripple across the entire region. A phone sent its final message at 10:52 p.m., a single letter, K. That message would become the haunting final clue in a mystery that would torment investigators and her family for years. Who was Dee Ann Warner? And why would her final message be so strange? Who would have wanted to hurt a woman who seemed to have everything, family, a business, and a life that many would envy? The truth is far darker than anyone could have imagined. Dee Ann Warner, known as Dee, was a 52-year-old mother of 5. She was a successful businesswoman who ran her own company, DDW Investments, a trucking operation she had built from the ground up. To those who knew her, she was strong, driven, and generous. Someone who would lend a hand whenever it was needed. She had been married to Dale Warner for 15 years, and on the surface, they seemed like just another couple from the tight-knit rural community. But beneath the surface, things were anything but ordinary. Despite her success, Dee was trapped in a marriage that seemed to be spiraling into darkness. Her husband, Dale Warner, had a reputation for being controlling and manipulative. He had built his life around his wife's hard work, but over the years, his controlling nature became more and more apparent. This wasn't just a story of a woman who went missing. It was the culmination of years of isolation, intimidation, and psychological abuse. On April 24th, 2021, Dee had made a decision that would change everything. For months, she had been considering leaving her husband. Her marriage, once built on love and partnership, had turned into something toxic. The relationship had become one of control. Dale had isolated her from her family, monitored her every move, and used both psychological and physical intimidation to keep her in line. That morning, she woke up with a sense of finality. Today was the day. She was going to tell Dale she was done with their marriage. She was going to leave. Dee spent that day preparing for what was to come. She went to get her eyelashes done at a local salon. But when she arrived, her esthetician, Kelly Jo Stace, noticed something alarming. Dee was visibly upset, with her eyes swollen from crying. She told Kelly that she had been fighting with Dale and that she planned to divorce him. But despite her emotional state, she scheduled another appointment for the following week, planning for the future, even though she was about to make a life-changing decision. Later in the day, Dee visited her children. She went to her daughter Amber's house and spent time with her son Zach. Amber saw the distress in her mother's eyes and knew something was wrong. She was crying, her face swollen from hours of tears. But to everyone around her, Dee still tried to carry on as if everything was normal. She even took her youngest daughter Rickle to a soccer game that afternoon. To the outside world, she was just another soccer mom, cheering from the sidelines. But inside, she was facing a much darker reality. She was preparing for a battle she wasn't sure she could win. It was during these final moments of seemingly normal activities that Dee made a chilling comment to her daughter Rickle. She confided that she was afraid for her life, telling her daughter, "I watched Dee like every night, and Dale could do something like that to me." The fear in her voice was unmistakable. She had already started to fear for her safety, and those words would prove to be prophetic. Throughout the day, Dee reached out to multiple people, including her children. saying that she was done with her marriage and that she planned to initiate a divorce. She even texted her son Zach, telling him that she was done with this and that she would be transferring her share of the family business to him. This was her final act of defiance. She was finally taking control of her life. But as the evening approached, everything began to spiral out of control. These final hours would be filled with tension, arguments, and ultimately fear. She found herself in the middle of a heated argument with her husband, Dale, and an employee named Todd Nank over business issues. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was about control, power, and betrayal. Dee suspected that Todd was backstabbing her in the business, and she wasn't wrong. But Dale, as always, sided with Todd. That night, Dee made a crucial decision that would shape the course of the evening. She sent her 9-year-old daughter, Angelina, to stay with a friend. Dee wanted to protect her daughter from what was about to unfold. She didn't want Angelina to witness the destruction of their family. But what Dee didn't know was that by sending her daughter away, she had just signed her own death warrant. At 10:52 p.m., Dee's phone sent its last message. A single letter, K. For anyone who knew her, this was completely out of character. Dee had always been talkative, expressive, and responsive in her messages. But that night there was nothing, just silence. And then, K, her family immediately knew something was terribly wrong. It was a chilling moment, and the mystery surrounding that final message would haunt investigators for years. What did it mean? Why did she send that letter? Was it a sign of distress? Or was it the final communication from a woman who had already begun to fear for her life? As the night wore on, things began to unravel quickly. Dale's account of the evening was full of inconsistencies and contradictions. He claimed that the couple reconciled, and that Dee had fallen asleep on the living room floor after he gave her a massage for her sore neck. According to Dale, she was peacefully snoring when he left for work the next morning. But the truth, as investigators would later discover, was far darker. The following morning, Dee's daughter Rickle arrived at the Warner farm for their usual Sunday breakfast. But when they knocked on the door, no one answered. This was highly unusual. Dee never missed their Sunday breakfast, and she always answered the door when Rickle arrived. When Rickle eventually found Dale, he was holding something he shouldn't have. Dee's $50,000 wedding ring. This was just the beginning of a story that would uncover betrayal, lies, and eventually murder. As investigators would soon discover, nothing about Dale's story added up, and Dee's disappearance would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Behind every disappearance is a story, one that, when examined closely, reveals the cracks in what appeared to be a perfect life. Dee Ann Warner's life wasn't just a fairy tale. It was a story of ambition, love, and ultimately betrayal. But beneath the surface, there were signs that her world was crumbling. To truly understand her disappearance, we must first go back to the beginning of her life and marriage, and explore the complex relationships that led to that fateful day in April 2021. Dee Ann Warner, known to those close to her as Dee, was born in 1963 in the tight-knit rural community of Lenawee County, Michigan. This area, known for its sprawling fields and peaceful surroundings, was where Dee grew up, surrounded by her family and friends. Life in Lenawee was simple, but grounded in strong values of community, hard work, and family. Dee's parents were well-respected members of the community, and she inherited their work ethic and entrepreneurial spirit. From a young age, it was clear that Dee was destined for something great. While many of her peers in the area took up farming or settled into small-town routines, Dee had bigger aspirations. She was ambitious, driven, and determined to make something of herself. In her early 20s, she took a leap of faith and started her own business. It was not an easy road to face the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated industry. But her determination and savvy business skills made her stand out. Over time, Dee built DDW Investments, a trucking business that started with humble beginnings but eventually grew into a multi-million-dollar operation. She became well known in the community, respected for both her business acumen and her generosity. But as successful as Dee was professionally, her personal life was another story. In 2006, Dee married Dale Warner, a man who was initially seen as charming and supportive. The two seemed like an ideal match at first. Dee was a successful entrepreneur, and Dale appeared to be the loving, supportive husband who would stand by her side as they built a life together. But behind closed doors, their relationship began to change in ways that Dee never could have imagined. Dale was a man who over time became increasingly controlling. At first, it seemed like a minor flaw, an occasional outburst over small things, an insistence on having things his way. But over the years, Dale's controlling nature grew more pronounced, and it started to affect every aspect of their marriage. Dale had always been involved in the family business, but instead of being a supportive partner, he began to undermine Dee's authority. He demanded access to her business records, took control over her finances, and even monitored her every move. He installed tracking devices on her car, insisted on knowing her whereabouts at all times, and often became angry if she spent time with her family or friends without his permission. For Dee, this was a slow and insidious form of manipulation. She began to feel trapped, not only in her marriage but in her own life. The once strong, independent woman who had built her own business was now in a relationship where she felt as though she was losing her sense of self. Despite the tension at home, Dee kept up appearances. She didn't want to burden her children with the growing problems in her marriage, and she continued to play the role of the successful businesswoman. But deep down, the cracks were starting to show. By the time 2020 rolled around, the issues in Dee's marriage had become impossible to ignore. Dale had not only isolated Dee from her family and friends, but he had also managed to insert himself into every aspect of her life, controlling her every move. He wasn't just a husband. He had become the kind of man who believed he owned her. Dee's children, especially her daughter Rickle, began to notice the changes in her. She was no longer the strong, independent woman they had known. She was withdrawn, anxious, and emotionally drained. Rickle, who had always been close to her mother, began to see how deeply affected Dee was by Dale's behavior. She heard her mother talk about the constant pressure she felt in her marriage, the emotional manipulation, and the fear that seemed to consume her. Dee confided in Rickle about her fears for the future. She talked about leaving Dale, but each time she pulled back. She wasn't sure how she would manage to escape, or if it was even possible. She feared for the safety of herself and her children, particularly her youngest daughter, Angelina, who had become the target of Dale's anger in the past. In December 2020, just a few months before her disappearance, Dee tried to leave Dale. She had confided in a close friend that she could no longer stay in the relationship. But when she attempted to leave, things took a dangerous turn. Dale refused to let her go, threatening her and manipulating her into staying. At that time, Dee confided in her business manager, Stephanie Volkler, that she had been physically hurt. She showed her a large bump on her forehead, what looked like blunt force trauma. But despite the injury, Dee felt trapped. She had built everything with Dale, and now she feared losing it all, especially her business and her children. In her moments of fear and uncertainty, Dee often turned to her children for comfort. They were her anchor, and she leaned on them more than she ever had before. Her children were the ones who could see the cracks in her marriage, and they knew something wasn't right. But Dee still tried to protect them from the worst of it. By April 2021, the tension in Dee's marriage had reached its breaking point. Her relationship with Dale had become irreparable, and Dee was finally prepared to take control of her life. She made the decision that would change everything. She was going to divorce Dale. Dee had been planning this for months, quietly preparing herself and trying to find the courage to leave. She confided in her children, telling them that she was done with the marriage and that she would be transferring her share of the family business to her son, Zach. She texted Zach that afternoon, saying, "I'm done with this. I'm giving everything to you. "I can't take it anymore." But Dee didn't just have the courage to take control of her life. She had the courage to face her fears. She was going to confront Dale that day, no matter what the consequences were. She had made the decision to end the marriage, and that decision would ultimately cost her everything. Dee's decision to leave was a turning point. It wasn't just about a divorce. It was about reclaiming her freedom. She was ready to break free from the control that had suffocated her for so long. But she had no idea how far Dale was willing to go to keep her under his thumb. That evening, as Dee prepared to confront Dale, the tension between them reached a breaking point. The argument between them wasn't just about a divorce. It was about power, control, and a life she was determined to escape. They fought about money, about the family business, and about the years of resentment that had built up between them. Dale, as always, sided with his employee Todd Nank, whom Dee suspected was betraying her in the business. This only added fuel to the fire. The argument was vicious, and Dee felt herself growing more and more desperate to escape. But at the same time, she was terrified of what might happen if she did. She had already sent her daughter Angelina away, ensuring that her daughter wouldn't witness whatever was about to unfold. In that moment, Dee knew that her life was about to change forever. But she wasn't sure how or if she would make it out alive. As Dee faced the truth of her marriage, she felt the weight of her decision bearing down on her. She had built her business, her life, and her family, but now she was prepared to walk away from it all. The only question was, would she survive long enough to do it? And what would happen when she finally stood up to the man who had controlled her life for so long? As the night wore on, the tension mounted, and Dee's fate was sealed in ways she couldn't have predicted. But one thing was certain. Her battle for freedom was about to become a fight for her life. With every passing hour, things began to seem more and more suspicious. Her family could sense it, but could anyone have predicted the dark truth that lay beneath the surface? Dee Ann Warner's disappearance wasn't a random event. It was the result of years of control, manipulation, and secrets. And when investigators began to peel back the layers, they found a husband whose behavior didn't align with a man grieving for his missing wife. The morning of April 25, 2021, began quietly on the Warner property. The sun rose over the vast fields, and life in the rural community seemed to go on as usual. But inside the Warner home, something was terribly wrong. According to Dale Warner, he woke up early that morning, around 6 o'clock, and saw his wife sleeping on the couch. He claimed that she was snoring softly, exhausted from the argument the night before. He told police later, "I got up, she was snoring away. I texted her, but she didn't answer. I figured she was still sleeping." But investigators would soon realize that this account was riddled with inconsistencies. His phone had gone completely silent hours before Dale claimed to have seen her sleeping. There were no calls, no texts, no activity, nothing. The woman, who was known for constantly communicating with her family and employees, had vanished without a trace. At around 9 in the morning, his daughter Rickle arrived at the family farm for their traditional Sunday breakfast. This was a weekly family ritual, one that Dee never missed. But when Rickle knocked on the door, there was no answer. The house was eerily silent. No sound of movement, no laughter, nothing. Rickle called out for her mother, but there was only quiet. It was the kind of silence that sends chills down your spine, the kind of silence that signals something is wrong. When Rickle finally found Dale outside, his reaction was strange. He was calm, too calm. He didn't seem alarmed that his wife was missing. Instead, he casually handed Rickle something that made her stomach drop. Dee's wedding ring. The ring was worth $50,000, a symbol Dee never removed. She wore it every single day. Dale told Rickle that he had found it on his desk in the office. He said Dee had left it there before she went away, but everyone who knew Dee knew she would never take that ring off. And if she were truly planning to leave, she would have taken her personal belongings with her. Yet both her cars were still on the property. Her purse, phone, and important documents were untouched. When police arrived to take Dale's statement, he told them that Dee had left on her own. He claimed she had taken a bag, her curling iron, her hairspray, and her phone. He said she might be staying with another man or perhaps had left the state. But the details didn't make sense. How could Dee have left when her vehicles were still parked at home? Even more suspicious was Dale's claim that Dee had a secret phone. In police body cam footage, Dale can be heard saying, "She's got a second phone. She doesn't know that I know she has it." This was one of the first major red flags. It revealed the extent of Dale's controlling behavior. He wasn't describing his wife's secret. He was exposing his own obsession with monitoring her life. He had installed tracking devices on her car, demanded access to her phone, and used surveillance systems to watch her every move. The idea that Dee had a secret phone was projection. It was Dale who had secrets. Most people whose spouse goes missing react with panic, fear, or desperation. They call the police immediately, organize search parties, or contact friends and relatives. But Dale didn't do any of that. He didn't call anyone for help. He didn't even report Dee missing until others insisted that something was wrong. Instead, his behavior in the days following her disappearance seemed cold and calculated. He changed the security system password on the property, effectively locking out others who might have tried to access the surveillance footage. He also started moving assets and making financial decisions related to their businesses almost immediately. While Dee's family was frantically searching for her, Dale seemed more concerned about protecting himself than finding his wife. His lack of concern spoke volumes. The man whose wife had supposedly left him didn't show sorrow, didn't make pleas for her safe return, and didn't cooperate fully with investigators. Instead, he started creating a story that investigators quickly began to see through. As detectives began piecing together the timeline, more inconsistencies appeared. Dale's claim that Dee had taken her curling iron, hairspray, and travel bag was strange. Not only did these items have no real significance, but they also seemed like part of an improvised list, a way to make her supposed departure seem believable. But the truth was far simpler. Nothing about Dee's disappearance pointed to her leaving voluntarily. Her business, her finances, and most importantly her children all remained untouched. There were no messages to family, no calls to friends, no withdrawals from her accounts. For a woman as responsible and connected as Dee, this was impossible to ignore. Her children were convinced almost immediately that something terrible had happened. Her son, Zach, told investigators that his mother would never have left without telling him. She was a devoted mother and grandmother, the kind of person who wouldn't go a single day without speaking to her family. Dale's manipulative nature began to emerge through interviews with family and employees. Former employees of DDW Investments described how Dale would constantly undermine Dee's authority, making her question her own decisions. He had convinced her that she couldn't manage the business without him, even though she had built it herself long before he came along. He also controlled her finances. Despite Dee being the primary owner of the company, Dale had inserted himself into the financial operations, giving himself access to accounts and making large, unexplained withdrawals. But it was his psychological manipulation that truly defined their relationship. Dale isolated Dee from her children and friends, planting seeds of doubt and guilt to keep her dependent on him. He used emotional outbursts, silent treatment, and intimidation to maintain control. Those closest to Dee said that by 2021 she was emotionally exhausted. She had become a shell of her former self, still kind and hard-working, but drained of the confidence and independence that once defined her. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms now walked on eggshells in her own home. In the days following Dee's disappearance, her family began to grow increasingly frustrated with the investigation. They felt that Dale was not being honest. Every time they asked questions, his story seemed to change. First, he said she left voluntarily. Then he claimed she might have run off with another man. Later, he hinted that she was suffering from stress and needed time alone. None of it made sense. Dee's brother, Greg Hardy, was particularly vocal about his suspicions. He told reporters that Dale's behavior didn't match that of a worried husband. Greg said, "You'd expect a man in his situation to be out there searching, calling everyone, putting up flyers." But Dale didn't do any of that. Greg also recalled a conversation where Dale mentioned that Dee had left her ring, purse, and phone behind. It was as if Dale had rehearsed the story, listing the items to make it sound believable. But Greg knew his sister better than that. He knew that she would never leave her daughter, her home, or her business behind without a word. As the investigation progressed, detectives began to see through Dale's facade. They examined surveillance footage, phone records, and financial transactions. Each discovery painted a more disturbing picture. Dale had lied about the timeline of events, manipulated evidence, and possibly destroyed key information that could have revealed what really happened. Even more telling was his behavior in the weeks following Dee's disappearance. Instead of cooperating with investigators, Dale started transferring business assets into his own name, cutting off employees who asked questions and distancing himself from anyone close to Dee. His calm demeanor during interviews struck investigators as unnerving. He showed no visible signs of grief, no emotion when speaking about his missing wife. When asked if he thought Dee could be dead, he responded flatly, "I don't know. Maybe she's somewhere starting over." But to those who knew him, Dale's calm wasn't composure, it was calculation. As days turned into weeks, the truth became harder to ignore. Dale's lies were unraveling. His strange behavior, his inconsistencies, and his calculated calmness all pointed to one conclusion. He knew far more than he was saying. Behind his composed exterior was a man who had spent years controlling every part of his wife's life. And now he was controlling the narrative around her disappearance. The family's fear deepened into certainty. Something terrible had happened to Dee Ann Warner, and the man who claimed to love her might be the very person responsible for her disappearance. It was a story that no one wanted to believe, but the evidence was beginning to tell a different story, a story of manipulation, betrayal, and murder. As the investigation into Dee Ann Warner's disappearance deepened, the truth began to emerge, layer by layer. What initially appeared to be a missing person case was slowly revealing itself to be something far darker, something far more calculated. Behind the curtains of deception was a man willing to do anything to protect his secrets and preserve his control. Dale Warner's actions weren't just about hiding his wife's disappearance. They were about controlling her legacy, her business, and her life. And those closest to him were starting to see the cracks in his story. The days following Dee's disappearance were filled with confusion, grief, and uncertainty. Investigators worked tirelessly, following leads, speaking to family members, and searching the Warner property. But with each passing day, the case seemed to grow colder. Dee's absence left a void, a mystery that no one could solve. At first, the investigators struggled to piece together what had happened. Dale's story about his wife leaving him seemed plausible on the surface. But something didn't sit right with the detectives. As the investigation gained momentum, private investigators were brought in to assist with the case. Billy Little, a private investigator working with Dee's family, began to uncover troubling signs that suggested something far more sinister was at play. The deeper they dug, the more they began to unravel a pattern of manipulation, lies, and financial deception. Every clue pointed back to Dale, and the more the investigators examined his actions, the more certain they became. This wasn't a simple case of a missing woman, it was a premeditated crime. One of the first signs that something was seriously wrong was the discovery of Dale's financial activities after Dee's disappearance. While Dee's family was busy searching for her, Dale was busy covering his tracks. Investigators soon discovered that shortly after Dee went missing, Dale began to make significant changes to the family's financial arrangements. Dale had long been involved in the business side of DW Investments. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that his actions were far more malicious than anyone had anticipated. He began transferring company assets into his own name, starting with trucks, equipment, and cash reserves. This wasn't the kind of financial activity you would expect from someone whose spouse had just disappeared. It was the kind of activity you would expect from someone who was preparing to walk away with everything. Private investigator Billy Little uncovered evidence that Dale had forged signatures and documents, transferring ownership of key assets from DDW Investments to a new company he created, DDW Transport. This wasn't a simple oversight. It was a deliberate effort to conceal Dale's share of the business. The timing of these transfers was striking. Just months after Dee's disappearance, Dale sold the trucking business to Laidlaw Carriers Bulk, a company that paid a hefty sum for the business. But none of the proceeds went to Dee's estate or her children. Instead, Dale pocketed the money for himself. The financial manipulation didn't stop there. Investigators discovered that Dale had been embezzling money from the business for years, diverting funds into personal accounts and making questionable transactions. He had been siphoning money from the business that Dee had built with her blood, sweat, and tears. For years, Dale had hidden his actions behind a veil of normalcy, but now the truth was coming to light. Every financial transaction, every asset transfer, told the story of a man who had been planning something much darker than anyone could have imagined. Further investigation into the financial records revealed a disturbing pattern of forged documents. Using what appeared to be a forged power of attorney from 2014, Dale had gained access to Dee's personal and business assets without her knowledge or consent. The forged document allowed him to sign away company assets and make financial decisions that were in direct violation of Dee's rights as a co-owner. The fact that Dale had been able to manipulate legal documents to gain control of DDW Investments only added to the growing suspicion that his wife's disappearance wasn't a simple case of running away. It was the result of a carefully crafted plan. The forging of documents wasn't the only tactic Dale used to manipulate his wife's estate. He had also taken control of their joint accounts, withdrawing large sums of money without any justification. For a woman as successful as Dee, her finances were vital to the future of her children and the business she had worked so hard to build. Yet Dale's actions were systematically eroding everything she had left behind. Investigators soon realized that Dale's motive was far more than just controlling his wife. He was erasing her legacy, taking control of everything she had built, and leaving her family with nothing. It became increasingly clear that the manipulation wasn't just about the business. It was about the power he sought over every aspect of Dee's life. As the investigation expanded, another key figure emerged: Todd Nink, an employee who had worked for DDW Investments for years. Todd was someone Dee had trusted, but as the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that he was far more involved in the events surrounding Dee's disappearance than anyone had initially realized. Todd had been an integral part of the business, managing the trucking operations that Dee had built. But there was something suspicious about his relationship with Dale. Private investigator Billy Little uncovered evidence that Todd was not just an employee. He was a partner in the scheme to take over the business. In the days following Dee's disappearance, Todd made suspicious moves. On April 25th, just hours after Dee went missing, Todd accessed the company's financial systems under a false name. He then removed lime from the Warner farm and drove it to a waste management facility in Chicago, all while using a fake identity to log the transactions. This activity raised red flags for investigators. Why would Todd be involved in moving company assets in the immediate aftermath of Dee's disappearance? And why was he using a false name? The timing of these activities was too coincidental to ignore. It was clear that Todd was complicit in the financial manipulation, and his connection to Dale was becoming more suspicious by the day. Moreover, Todd's involvement wasn't limited to financial dealings. In recorded conversations with his massage therapist, Todd admitted to being deeply involved in the case. He confessed that he knew more than he was letting on, and he even mentioned that Detective Kevin Greer, who was leading the investigation, had a personal relationship with Todd's first cousin. This was a clear conflict of interest, and it raised questions about the integrity of the investigation itself. As more evidence came to light, the true extent of the financial fraud became undeniable. Dale had manipulated every aspect of his wife's business, forging documents, hiding assets, and siphoning money from the very company Dee had worked to build. His actions were not only criminal, they were deeply personal. This wasn't just about money. It was about erasing Dee from the business and taking everything she had worked for. It was about maintaining control. Dale's involvement in the scheme didn't just affect the business, it affected everyone around him. His children, who had once looked up to him, were left in the dark, unable to understand why their father would do such a thing to their mother. Dee's family, who had been searching desperately for answers, now had to face the devastating reality that their loved one had been the victim of both emotional and financial manipulation. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The financial fraud, the forged documents, and the involvement of Todd Nank were all part of a larger story, a story of control, deceit, and betrayal. And as investigators dug deeper, the truth about Dee's disappearance began to take shape. The discovery of hidden evidence didn't just change the course of the investigation, it revealed the true extent of Dale Warner's deception. It was a story of a man who was willing to destroy everything his wife had worked for, all in the pursuit of power and control. But the deeper the investigators dug, the closer they came to the ultimate truth. The truth about what had really happened to Dee Ann Warner and who was truly responsible for her disappearance. After more than 3 years of searching, the unthinkable happened. The truth was finally revealed, but in the most horrific and shocking way. What had seemed like a never-ending nightmare for Dee's family and a mystery that no one could solve was about to come to a devastating conclusion. The search for Dee Ann Warner's remains had led to countless dead ends, but in the summer of 2024, the investigation finally uncovered what had been hidden in plain sight all along. It was the discovery that would haunt everyone involved and mark the beginning of the end for Dale Warner's lies. For over 3 years, Dee's family and investigators searched tirelessly for any trace of her. They combed through the rural landscape of Lenawee County, checked properties, followed leads, and spoke to anyone who might have seen something. But no one could find any trace of Dee Ann Warner. She seemed to have vanished without a single clue. During that time, investigators chased down every lead, following false trails and hearing countless theories. Some believed she had run away to start a new life. Others suggested that she had been a victim of foul play. But despite all the effort, no one could ever find the answers they were looking for. Dale Warner's calm demeanor and his continuing manipulations only added to the sense of confusion and frustration. For years, it seemed like the truth would never come to light, but deep down, Dee's family never gave up. They believed that someday, someone would find the answers, someone would uncover the truth. The case lingered in the minds of everyone in Lenawee County. Dee's children and siblings held on to hope despite the uncertainty. They never stopped searching for their mother, never stopped searching for the woman who had given so much of herself to others. In August 2024, nearly 3.5 years after Dee's disappearance, the case finally took a shocking turn. A new lead emerged, and investigators began to focus their efforts on a property that had already been searched numerous times, the Warner farm on Paragon Road, just a few miles from where Dee was last seen. The police were acting on new evidence, fresh insights from the ongoing investigation, and updated search techniques that had come a long way since 2021. This time, law enforcement executed a more targeted search of the property, revisiting areas that had previously been overlooked. They focused specifically on the farm's barn and some of the industrial equipment located there. Among the pieces of machinery, investigators found something that would change everything: an ammonia tank, typically used for agricultural purposes. But this wasn't just any tank. The investigators noticed something off about it. It had been resealed and repainted, making it look like any other piece of farm equipment. The tank appeared to be untouched by time, as though it had always belonged among the other machinery. However, the authorities were about to uncover a chilling secret hidden within it. When the tank was opened, what was inside sent shockwaves through the investigation team. It wasn't fertilizer or chemicals, as one would expect from an ammonia tank. Instead, what they found were human remains, carefully concealed and sealed away in the very place that had been under their noses all along. The realization hit hard. Dee's body had been hidden for over 3 years, sitting there on the Warner property, a mere 4 miles away from where she was last seen. The entire time, search parties had been looking elsewhere, while the truth had been lying in plain sight. As investigators continued to remove the remains, the horror of the situation became undeniable. It wasn't just the discovery of a body. It was the knowledge that Dee had been hidden in a place so ordinary, so overlooked, that no one could have possibly imagined it. The emotional weight of the discovery weighed heavily on everyone involved. His family, who had fought so hard for answers, were left grappling with the fact that their loved one had been so close to them the entire time. The remains were quickly sent for examination, and it didn't take long for the Jackson County Medical Examiner's Office to confirm the identity of the deceased. Through dental records, they positively identified the body as that of Dee Ann Warner. It was an excruciating moment for her family, finally knowing what had happened, but also knowing that their worst fears had come true. Dee's children, who had spent years wondering and hoping for a different outcome, now had the painful clarity they had been seeking. The identification confirmed what they had suspected all along. Dee was dead. The physical evidence matched what they had been fearing for years, and the medical examiner ruled her death a homicide. The idea that someone had deliberately hidden her body for years, with no regard for her family's anguish, was beyond comprehension. The medical examiner withheld certain details of the manner of her death, pending further investigation, but the ruling of homicide left no room for doubt. The truth was out there now, and with it came a new, horrifying understanding of how far someone they had trusted, was willing to go. With the discovery of Dee's body came the final unraveling of Dale Warner's story. Over the years, he had consistently maintained that his wife had left him, that she had disappeared voluntarily, and that he had nothing to do with her vanishing. But now, as the physical evidence piled up, his lies began to disintegrate. Dale had spent the past 3 years playing the part of a concerned husband. He had continued to insist that Dee had left on her own accord, that she had run off to start a new life. But the discovery of her body inside the ammonia tank painted a different picture, a picture of premeditated murder and a deliberate effort to conceal her remains. Investigators reviewed Dale's actions during the time Dee went missing. The suspicious inconsistencies in his story, his strange calmness, and his attempts to cover up the evidence were now crystal clear. His actions weren't just those of a grieving husband. They were the actions of a man desperately trying to hide the truth. Dale had been the one to hide Dee in plain sight. He had hidden her body inside a piece of agricultural machinery that no one thought to check. It was as if he had been confident that no one would ever discover what he had done. The chilling part was how simple and audacious his actions had been. For over 3 years, the body of the woman he had murdered had been sitting on his property, unseen and untouched. The discovery of Dee's remains was devastating for her family, but it also brought a sense of closure. They had spent years wondering if she was alive or dead, and now at least they knew the truth. But the pain of losing her, of knowing that someone so close to them had taken her life, was overwhelming. Dee's children were forced to confront the horror of what had happened. They had always known something was wrong with their father's behavior, but this was beyond anything they could have imagined. The thought that their own father could be responsible for their mother's death was too much to bear. For Dee's siblings, the pain was equally profound. They had watched as their sister's life unraveled and had spent years searching for her, only to find that her body had been hidden so near to home. The emotional toll of the search was excruciating, but now they had to reconcile the woman they knew with the horrific reality of how she had died. The discovery of Dee Ann Warner's body in the ammonia tank marked the end of a long, painful journey for her family, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice would finally be served. The evidence against Dale Warner had mounted, and his lies had been exposed. He would no longer be able to hide behind his manipulations and deceit. The truth had come to light, and now the focus would shift to holding him accountable for the horrific crime he had committed. Dale's story had unraveled, and the final chapter of Dee's life was being written in the courts. Her family could now begin the difficult process of healing, knowing that her voice had finally been heard, and her killer would no longer be able to escape justice.